Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll give folks a minute or two to start rolling in. Thank you for joining this webinar on total resource costs through the SEEK, or the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative Program. My name is Helena Rim, and I'm a project manager at the Local Government Commission, and we're one of the nonprofit partners of the SEEK program. As part of SEEK, we host an annual forum that provides learning, sharing, and networking opportunities to help local governments save energy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their communities, and catalyze climate action. And this webinar is actually a repeat performance from the 2019 SEEK Forum this past June of a breakout session on total resource costs. So you'll hear from some of the same presentations or presenters from the forum. So I will give it another minute, and then we'll move on to the participant poll before starting up on the presentations. All right. So before we move on to the presentations, we're going to do a quick participant poll to get to know everyone a little bit better. And you'll see the poll questions pop up on your screen, and then I'll be sharing the results with everyone as soon as we're finished. And we'll give folks about 2 to 3 minutes in total to answer the questions, and we'll see how long that takes. So I'm launching the poll right now. We have 4 questions. The first one is, what type of organization do you represent? The second one is to indicate which utility or utilities serve your jurisdiction. Third question is, did you attend the total resource cost session at the SEEK Forum this past June? And our fourth one is, how familiar are you with total resource cost and its impact on energy efficiency programs? So we'll give folks another minute or so to answer these questions. As you answer the questions, I just wanted to note that if you have any questions for our speakers during the webinar, you can use the Zoom question function to type in your question, comment on another participant's question, or upvote it if you want to make sure that it gets answered. All right, let's see. Okay, we'll stop the poll there. So it looks like we have about a little less than half of the webinar participants are from local or regional governments. A lot of folks from the PG&E territory. A lot of folks who didn't attend the forum breakout session this past June, which is great, so you get to learn something new. And most folks seem to be somewhat familiar or not at all familiar with the topic. Awesome, thank you guys. All right, Now I'm going to pass it over to our moderator for today, who is Nicole Manzanares. Nicole manages messaging, outreach, and engagement for SoCalRen's public agency programs, and she leads the enrollment process for new agencies looking to join the SoCalRen and designs and facilitates workshops and webinars for the program. So take it away, Nicole.
Great, thank you, Helena. Hello, everyone, and thank you for kicking off your early Monday morning with us for TRC for the rest of us, breaking down cost effectiveness. Sounds like a lot of you are new to the topic, so it's great to bring more folks into the conversation here. And it really is a pleasure for me, once again, to be facilitating this conversation among experts. So if you are one of those that is new to the conversation and you're wondering why TRC, or total resource cost, is so important, this is the core cost effectiveness test which governs energy efficiency ratepayer funded programs across California. And it really guides the portfolio decisions by the investor owned utilities and any of the other non-IOU program administrators as well. So today we are breaking down the concepts of cost effectiveness for those of you who aren't necessarily living and breathing energy policy daily, a number of you out there, and myself as well. We're also offering insights from the program implementation world. So next slide, please. Here's the discussion planned, and we're building upon concepts throughout, just so you're prepared for that. To start, we are kicking off with a Back to Basics primer that introduces cost effectiveness concepts and evaluation metrics broadly, and then we unpack the TRC equation itself. Many of you might know, but it could be new to some, the California Public Utilities Commission has recently ruled in favor of more stringent TRC portfolio thresholds for future programs. And so we'll talk about those policy impacts and how programs that are currently successful are impacted specifically. We'll show you what portfolios have looked like historically and what they would need to look like in order to meet that higher cost effectiveness ratio. We'll also be discussing interactions and really the complementary dynamics between resource programs, or those that are bound by the TRC requirements, and non-resource programs, which are not factored into portfolio cost effectiveness. And lastly, we'll present alternative options for measuring cost effectiveness, given the limitations of current TRC methodology. Next slide. And of course, a very brief self-introduction. My name is Nicole Manzanares. I lead engagement and outreach initiatives for the Energy Coalition's programs, as Helena introduced. I really am thrilled we get the opportunity to deliver this encore presentation as a webinar and lasting resource, because again, it's an opportunity to bring people to the conversation and to build some shared context surrounding cost effectiveness policy. So in the spirit of broadening perspectives and learning together, I just want to reiterate Helena's invite to contribute questions and comments throughout the webinar. I'll be monitoring the activity in Zoom, hopefully engaging with some folks, and definitely pulling up questions for the individual speakers after they present, and then compiling some of those to address during the Q&A at the end. So please keep those coming. Next slide, please. So now let's meet our speakers. Chris Ford is my colleague at the Energy Coalition. He leads a team delivering energy efficiency projects through the SoCalRen public agency programs. And SoCalRen is the Southern California Regional Energy Network. Chris will provide the primer on cost effectiveness policy, defining the inputs of the TRC equation for you to gain better understanding of the various costs and avoided costs that are evaluated therein. And then he'll lead us through an exercise demonstrating what happens to energy savings that are claimed through these programs once they're reported to the CPUC. And a friendly face or name here, Lou Jacobson is joining us again, but he has shifted into a new role since the SEEK Forum in June. After over 10 years at the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, leading various demand-side management programs, Lou has left and is now the Director of Fiscal Services for the Eureka City Schools. But don't worry, LU plans to not only help the district chart its sustainability energy path, but plans also to remain engaged in the broader energy advocacy space. So today, LU will discuss program design and portfolio balance, exploring some of the challenges and the individual power of some of the TRC inputs on the whole calculation. And finally, we'll be hearing from Mohit Chabra. He's with NRDC and focuses on affecting policy to accelerate the transition to a sustainable and clean energy future. He provides analysis and strategic guidance to policymakers and other stakeholders at the state, regional, and national levels as well. So if you attended the session at SEEK, we heard from Mohit's colleague Laura Ettinson, and drawing on some similar themes that Laura presented, Mohit will comment on the limitations of the current cost-effectiveness methodology, and he'll be presenting opportunities for evolving those methods. Next slide, please. So, what does it mean to say something is cost-effective? First off, cost-effectiveness is a ratio. It is a comparison of relative costs and benefits of different courses of action. And a cost-effective outcome is a result that is equal to or greater than 1 here. The TRC is the star metric today, but in any cost-effectiveness equation, it's important to know what goes into the numerator as a benefit, conversely, what goes into the denominator as a cost, and then, of course, who is on the receiving end of those costs and benefits. Next slide. So I use this slide in an exercise to get to know the audience at the SEEK Forum, similarly to our opening poll here. And, you know, once again, a lot of diversity among participants, certainly a significant number from the stakeholder groups that are shown here. And these are key considerations in the TRC equation. So now it's time to dive in. And at this point, I will pass the presentation over to Chris to orient us with the equation itself and its foundational concepts. Next slide, please.
All right, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so I'm here today to talk about the background and structure of the total resource cost, why it matters, and where this archaic econometric evaluation of cost-benefit ratios has come from. Next slide, please. So first, a little background on the Energy Coalition. We are a nonprofit energy consulting firm with over 40 years of experience serving the public sector in California. Next slide, please. So the Energy Coalition is the designer and implementer of the Southern California Regional Energy Network public agency programs. This program operates in Southern California, Southern California gas territory. We serve public agencies, K through 12 schools, water and wastewater districts as well. And to date, we've helped save over 70 million kilowatt hours of energy annually and captured over $30 million in incentives and financing to help get projects done. Next slide, please. All right, so a quick overview of this section. We're going to talk about how cost effectiveness is measured, what total resource cost is. We're going to dive into the components of total resource cost, in particular avoided cost. And then we're going to ask a question, some food for thought. Is TRC for everyone? Next slide, please. All right, so talking about how cost effectiveness is measured. So Nicole mentioned earlier it is a ratio of benefits to cost, but what's important is to consider what perspective we take when we look at evaluating those benefits and those costs. So in California, the CPUC has what's called the California Standard Practice Manual, which was created in 1983, so it's celebrating its 36th birthday this year. It has a selection of approved tests to consider cost-benefit ratios from different perspectives. You have the participant cost test, which looks at will cost increase or decrease specifically for the program participants. The ratepayer impact measure, which determines how costs will affect utility rates. And the societal cost test, which looks at total cost to society based on program impacts. But what we're here to talk about today is the total resource cost, which looks at cost benefit from the utility and its ratepayers and the participants' combined perspective. So it's the only test that tries to look at two perspectives at once. And the total resource cost is important because the TRC is the cost effectiveness test required for all demand-side programs in California. Next slide, please. So total resource cost, like any cost-benefit ratio, it's benefits versus costs. But we need to convert our thinking about what constitutes a benefit and what constitutes a cost into a couple terms. So the costs are more traditional. They're measure and program related costs. So costs that are required to implement a measure or program, which may be borne by the participant that is implementing the actual measures, and the cost of the program administrator who's running the program. But the benefits are in terms of avoided costs. So these are avoided costs to the utility and its ratepayers and avoided costs to the participant. So we're going to dive into the benefits portion of the equation for this section, and then Lou is going to talk a little bit more about the way costs are determined on that side of the equation later on. Next slide, please. So to talk about avoided costs, we need to understand some of the important terms and lingo involved in the avoided cost-benefit analysis. So the main thing is the cost factors. When you save a kilowatt hour or a therm, what costs are avoided by the utilities? So this looks mainly at costs, reduced costs in infrastructure, but there are also costs in programs and planning. So we can look at that as a function of the energy savings, which are the utility recognized measured savings or measure savings. And then another important factor to consider is effective useful life. How long will a measure or program continue to deliver those energy savings reliably? And then the next thing we have to consider is also discount rate, which, because we're talking about avoided costs, we have to account for the time value of money over that effective useful life. Another important thing to consider is the gross realization rate, which is kind of like a safety factor that the utilities can apply to a measure or program that helps to account for potential overestimation of savings and to make sure that since the savings delivered by a program are ultimately used in planning for energy resources on the grid, we want to make sure that those savings are reliable. And then the net to gross ratio, which accounts for free riders in the program. Free ridership being participants in the program that are using resources that they didn't really need in order to complete their project. And so this attempts to make sure that projects are really targeting the customers that need these resources the most. Next slide, please. So what we have here is the avoided cost factors on the avoided cost curve. Essentially, when an energy efficiency measure or program is completed or forecast, the savings provided by that measure have to move through this, have to be applied to this curve in order to determine those avoided cost benefits that we talked about. So since the TRC benefits are mainly based on avoided grid infrastructure costs as a function of those energy savings, the avoided costs naturally tend to align with the grid's needs on a time value basis. So the shape here is pretty familiar. Given the California duck curve, avoided costs are going to be higher for energy savings during those peak demand periods, lower during periods of high solar availability on the grid. And calculating the avoided cost benefits of an energy efficiency measure program are closely tied now not to just how much energy is saved, but to when those savings occur. So this is done by using the measure's load shape, which looks at energy saved by the measure for each hour of the day, and applying it to this curve. Some measures provide equal savings during every hour, such as an LED light in a room where the lighting is on 24/7, but others have more complex load shapes, like an HVAC measure, which might offer energy savings that are affected by weather conditions or occupancy schedules and other variables. Right now, there are several proposals being considered by the CPUC through their stakeholder process that could make really important changes to different parts of this curve. And if you'd like to learn more, I highly recommend that you check out the CPUC's website and find out how to get involved in those stakeholder processes. One piece of food for thought, too, as you look at the list of the different cost factors here and you see a lot of infrastructure-based costs, I think it's important to consider what other benefits a ratepayer-funded program can or should provide. So some things that are not created here are job creation, equity, public health benefits. Essentially, if it's not on this curve, then it is not counted as a benefit of a ratepayer-funded program. And so I think it's important to consider all of the things that we want a ratepayer-funded program to do and all of the benefits that it can provide when we look at its avoided costs. Next slide, please. So again, to determine those avoided cost benefits in terms of savings per year, we need to take that energy efficiency measure load shape, apply it to those avoided cost factors, and out of that we get that avoided cost benefits for each year. So before we do that, we have to decide how much energy savings an energy efficiency measure can deliver. And so we're going to walk through a little example to show how these different parameters and factors come into play when trying to calculate utility recognized savings. Next slide, please. So here we have a basic energy efficiency measure that's delivering energy savings every year for 7 years of its effective useful life. And while we look at these as energy savings, I want you to consider them in the context of avoided cost benefits. Each of those bars represents some amount of savings to the grid that's going to get factored into the cost effectiveness ratio for this measure. Next slide, please. So the first thing we have to do is apply a baseline impact. Currently, in California with Title 24 code and Title 22 appliance standards, the on-bill savings realized by an energy efficiency measure are often not equivalent to the savings that get to be used for calculating avoided cost benefits. If there is a baseline and a measure is going to bring a facility or an end-use application from below code to above code, then you only get to count the savings generally that are above code. There are some specific exceptions for certain types of measures, but in the context of a very normal equipment replacement or retrofit, that's typically the approach. So we make a cut here to the savings that we get to count. Next slide, please. All right, and so the next thing we need to apply is that gross realization rate. So we need to make sure that we give some safety factor for the energy efficiency savings we can reliably deliver for grid planning purposes. So we make another cut. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So now we need to account for those free riders, for participants taking advantage of program services who didn't really need them to complete the installation of the measure. And so we further reduce the energy savings recorded for the measure. Next slide, please. And now, because we're thinking in the context of a cash flow, because we're thinking of the amount of avoided cost benefits delivered every year via those energy savings, we need to apply a discount rate. In the case of the California utilities and the CPUC ratepayer funded programs, that discount rate is around 7%. It is assigned as the weighted average cost of capital for the utilities. Next slide, please. And so what you see in just a relative sense is the way a project or the way an energy efficiency measures savings and thus its avoided cost benefits, the entire benefit side of the TRC equation, gets reduced by these different factors, safety factors, considerations of free riders, and other parameters that ultimately lower the savings that can be used to claim benefits. And this is what would be going into the avoided cost calculator to determine the numerator of the TRC equation. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to just pose a question. Should every energy efficiency program be evaluated using total resource cost? In California, the resource programs are required to use TRC. Non-resource programs are not, but portfolios ultimately must achieve a portfolio-wide TRC of 1.0, which includes those non-resource costs against the benefits provided by the resource programs. Next slide, please. So stepping back slightly in time here, the original energy efficiency ratepayer-funded program model looked like this. We had the utilities implementing, or being the program administrators of, rather, energy efficiency resource programs. Those resource programs were designed to serve different customer segments with the ultimate goal of delivering energy savings for resource planning. And when cost-effectiveness tests get applied to these types of programs, they tend to focus the programs on the customer segments that will be most likely to deliver high benefits and high participation rates. And so you start to see kind of targeting of certain customers that are more able to participate in the program based on their available resources and interest. Next slide, please. So along came the RENs, the CCAs, and third-party implementers, as well as third-party program administrators. And the idea being that these other groups could provide services that supplement and complement the programs and services offered by the utility program administrators in order to reach customers that ultimately are paying into ratepayer funds but are receiving less of the benefits or less access to those programs. And so these tend to be non-resource programs that are channeling customers into the same resource programs run by the utilities, ultimately resulting in more energy savings and better cost effectiveness ratios for those programs. And so the question here is, should those third parties, should the RENs and the CCAs that are working on channeling customers into participating in IOU energy efficiency resource programs be responsible for meeting the same cost effectiveness thresholds as the standard resource programs? When you have to design programs that get out of the way of the programs that are built to be high performing cost effective programs, you're innately going to be stuck with more challenging customer outreach, more costly customer markets to try to penetrate. And it definitely creates a different set of challenges for those implementers and those program administrators. And I'm going to pause there just to give another minute here to see if there are any questions.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. I haven't seen any specific questions come through on the Zoom chat, but we will pause for just about half a minute and see if anybody has something to comment on. And I know that Lou dives in a little bit more to talk about avoided costs and some of those TRC metrics, but I will throw out here, Chris, you mentioned some of the avoided cost factors or the benefits that aren't really part of the equation, public health benefits. What are some of the others that aren't factored into that load profile for avoided cost factors?
Yes, we mentioned things like job creation, which any successful energy efficiency program should have that as a benefit and not in a characteristic, not just a side effect. I would say the same thing for equity. Again, going back to this slide here, making sure that programs are accessible regardless of the resources available to the participant. And making sure that we're doing more than just earmarking money for disadvantaged communities or hard-to-reach customers, but making sure that the programs are tooled so that they can be more useful to those customer segments or more accessible to those customer segments.
Great. Okay, and I do have one question coming through. I think we have time. Can you give an example of underserved customer groups and a commensurate program?
So that's definitely a challenge right there. I'd say personally I come from the public agency sector, but I know that in disadvantaged communities, multifamily housing, there's a lot of challenges with the incentive split, with trying to find out the right way to balance outreach for customers that are renting or may not have permanent residency, and then to make sure that tenants feel like they can be properly compensated for the upgrades and the savings they're passing along to their tenants. Navigating that is definitely challenging and an important thing for California given the housing crisis in this state. So I'd say that's one example. Rural, hard-to-reach customers are another one. Trying to find programs and not just programs, services, but also the right communication channels to reach rural customers to make sure that you're marketing the benefits of programs to them. And definitely customers with smaller usage, just because a customer may not have significant energy usage doesn't mean that they aren't still operating below code or that their utility bill isn't still a burden to bear. And so designing programs that still help customers regardless of their size or their impact is important.
Okay. And then I think one more question, and then I'll try to bring some back up at the very end. Who determines how many or what avoided costs are used to make the TRC calculation? Yeah,
so that's a great question. So there is a stakeholder process, the CPUC, I think on a biannual basis, and a recent update to the societal cost test confirmed the process for, I think every other year minor changes are able to be proposed and discussed in a stakeholder process and then ruled on by the CPUC, and then every other year, alternating years, are major changes. So right now, like I mentioned, there are several proposals out there from utilities and third parties for different changes to those individual cost factors and to improve some of the data behind the creation of those cost factors. And I'd definitely advise anybody that's working in a ratepayer funded program to be paying close attention to that and to maybe even get involved if you want to have your voice heard.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, folks, for submitting questions. I have a queue that we'll return to later in the presentation and certainly leave room at the end. But right now, I'll ask for the next slide and pass over the presentation to Lou Jacobson. Take it away, Lou.
Happy Monday, everybody. So if you could just go straight to the next slide, we'll jump right in. So I just kind of want to present the 2020 statewide CEDARS filings by sector, and I promise you we'll go into a little bit more detail. However, I always like an hourglass approach. So what we're going to do is kind of start at the high level, work down to a more granular examination of how the TRC may impact program design and portfolio balance, then take it back all the way out and talk about equity and equality. So what you're looking at right now is a screenshot directly from the CEDARS web portal. And if folks on the call have not gone to this portal, I strongly recommend that you do. It's very, very interesting. You can look at all the PEA's submissions for 2020, what they're thinking. You can even drive down into the program and the measures to be installed. What you're looking at right now is the statewide submissions across all PEAs except CCAs and RENs. Please note that I also excluded codes and standards from this, and there's just a few toggles, and you can bring CCAs, RENs, and codes and standards back in. However, for the presentation of this particular image, I excluded, again, CCAs, RENs, codes, and standards. Now, when you're balancing at the high level, the state, meaning the regulators, energy division, they really want to see a TRC that's going to exceed 1 after review. And so that's why there's such a laser focus on a forecasted TRC of 1.25. The assumption is after everything comes in, that forecasted value will likely be above 1. And this value of 1 becomes incredibly important. A TRC of 1 or greater means that there's a net benefit to the generalized ratepayer group, not so much the customer, but the generalized ratepayer class. So at the state level, Energy Division really wants to balance out the statewide portfolio to deliver that TRC of 1 or greater. Now, if you go one level deeper, each PA is really required by law to deliver a TRC of 1.2, or a forecasted TRC of 1.25 or greater. Again, please note, I'm just talking about the IOUs or investor-owned utilities, community choice aggregations that have elected to become a program administrator may be subject to slightly different requirements. Specifically, they just have to deliver a TRC of 1 or greater for their ramp-up time period, which would be the first 3 years. Regional energy networks, or RENs, do not have to hit a TRC of 1 or greater. And for today's conversation, we're really not focusing in on RENs per se, except for the inclusion and the equity and the equality part of all of this. And so what you're looking at right here is an image that shows at a portfolio level, the state will not deliver a TRC that exceeds 1 on the forecast basis this year, which is a really, really big deal. In addition, the reason that I highlighted the public sector TRC is we're all, I imagine, or most of us, are public sector employees or work for programs serving the public sector. So what you can see here is that omitting cross-cutting, public sector is the lowest performing sector within the statewide portfolio. And that is a very important attribute to keep in your minds as we work through this, because ultimately, what the hope is after this presentation, you all will be able to go out and have a little bit more knowledge, be equipped with a little bit more knowledge to be able to engage third-party implementers in a way that delivers effective projects to your community and, of course, your organizations. And so if you were to go to CEDARS and dive deep, what you'll start seeing is that each program will have varying TRCs. And, of course, what you're seeing here is the net sum of all of those. Next slide, please. So let's break down TRC a little bit more. And Chris spoke to this, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because it's actually incredibly important. So we're going to talk about avoided costs, and we already have a little bit. We're going to talk about N to G, which is free ridership and spillover. To take a step back, spillover is effectively the keeping up with the Joneses concept, right? My neighbor did it, so I'm going to do it. There's a little bit of influence there that's accounted for in net to gross. The remaining part of net to gross is the free rider concept. So net to gross, as you'll see throughout this presentation, is going to be a pretty important concept. It has the ability to impact avoided costs and the net value or net total sum of savings delivered to a portfolio, which becomes really, really important. On the back side, or the denominator side, you're going to see non-incentive costs. Excuse me. This is administrative costs, measured costs, or participant costs. We'll come back to that one. Times net to gross, incentives paid to the participant, and then incentives paid to free riders, which is a really important part of all of this. And so when we look at administrative costs, that could be the program administrator costs, the third-party administrator costs. Incentives to customers is exactly that. the net sum value of incentives paid to non-free riders, and then participant costs, which can be a little bit complex. And so if we're dealing with like a deemed measure or prescriptive measure, often participant costs are prescribed as incremental measure costs. Excuse me, one second. When you're dealing with a custom calculated project, participant costs may be determined by full measure costs. We'll come back to that one because it is quite important. And then, of course, incentives paid to free riders. Now, the challenge with net to gross and free ridership is that often in the public space, what you're going to see, except for K-12, that public entities are treated the same way under net to gross as small businesses. So in some cases, you might have a net to gross ratio of, let's say, 0.65 in the public space. Effectively, what that means is 35% of all those incentives being dispersed to participants are considered incentives dispersed to free riders. And so although K-12 has kind of a flat 0.85 net to gross, the rest of the public sector does not. And really you have to chase the measure code. Now, we don't necessarily expect everybody on this call to go to that level of detail, so the real takeaway here is as long as that net to gross is depressed, the general assumption is that there is free ridership in the public space that will increase the denominator. And if we increase the denominator without commensurate increases in the numerator, that is going to depress the TRC and make serving the public sector incrementally more challenging to third parties. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the formula, how do those different variables play out? So the image here you're looking at is an image that was shared with many implementers by the IOUs. And I think this one is incredibly powerful because when you look at this, it really tells you, well, what levers can I pull as an implementer, or what levers should I be cognizant of as a participant? Because I think each one of us has ownership in the way that we engage with third-party programs, whether we're a non-resource program or implementers ourselves, or in the case of my current role, a prospective participant in a third-party program or a local program. And so when you look at this, what you're seeing is that measure costs are a huge lever. And so if you follow kind of that red line there, kind of the darker red line, what you can see is that if you decrease measure costs, you're going to be increasing the TRC pretty significantly. The other two levers to pull are KWH and therm savings, and KW and EUL. And so, and I'm going to take a step back, KW actually doesn't impact the calculation, I misspoke there. And so really what you have is EUL, KWH, and therm and measure costs that are substantial levers in increasing TRC. So when you think about what we can actually do either as participants or third-party implementers is we can really focus in on measure costs to the degree that we can on custom calc measures, and of course to the degree that we engage in proceedings and rulings that allow us to look at and examine incremental measure costs associated with the JIR database and prescriptive measures. And so the goal here, particularly on custom calc measures in the public space, is to reduce your participant costs as much as possible, or those measure costs. So on the implementer side, one thing that you could do is reduce incentives and replace those incentives with effective financing. Whether or not you can actually sell a project at the end of the day is another question, but in the case of the TRC and the levers that we can pull, we can certainly supplant incentives with some type of effective financing. Since incentives are made part of that participant cost, less your actual free riders, then that's going to decrease the denominator. On the avoided cost numerator side, what you can look at is KWH and therms. Again, net to gross becomes a hugely important part of this conversation because the net to gross actually reduces your overall KWH net savings because you're omitting the savings that are attributed to free riders. In addition, you can look at your calculations associated with custom calc measures, and of course your avoided cost calc curves. And before we go on to that, I do just want to point out, and I always find this quite interesting, you would think administrative costs would be a huge lever, right? We're paying, 30% to administer this across the program administrator, the IOUs, and perhaps the, third-party providers. But when you follow that brighter red line, you can see it does matter, but it's not as influential as some of these other factors, such as energy savings, kWh, therms, and measure costs. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the two levers, kWh and therms, as being hugely important in combination with measure costs, you have to take into consideration avoided costs. And this is something Chris spoke to a little bit. And so what I've done here is kind of expanded on what Chris presented. And you have kind of a 2019 avoided cost calc presentation on the load curves, and then 2024. And of course, it's hard to crystal ball out into 2024, but the avoided cost calculator does allow for that. And what you can see is that the evening hours become more and more important from an electricity savings perspective. And so it's not just about saving raw gross kWh anymore within program design. It's actually about when you save that kWh. And so programs, this is my crystal ball, that target the evening hours are going to become more and more desirable at the administrative level. So we could go out there and we could deliver a program that saves energy within your small business that's open from 8 to 5. It simply will not be as productive to the general ratepayer class as a program that's out there delivering savings within a commercial or residential sector between the hours of, let's say, 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. or even over the evening hours. And so as you're looking at programs that have a primary focus on delivering electricity savings, I do expect that those programs are going to begin to target those early evening and late evening hours. And so the way this kind of shakes out would be a program that could deliver savings, let's say, scaled to your restaurant sit-down sector, which would be building type RSD. Another way this might shake out are programs that really prioritize lighting through exterior lighting, so you could deliver savings dusk till dawn, although it wouldn't be as effective as, let's say, delivering savings within that 4 to 9 time period. It would still deliver savings across kind of the shoulder time, and you wouldn't be delivering savings during the afternoon. And so do know that as time marches forward, programs are going to have to respond to the valuation of energy savings associated with the avoided cost calculator, which means it's going to be more and more challenging to deliver projects that are associated with energy savings during the middle of the afternoon. When we start talking about program design and balance, I think that programs are always going to want to serve the commercial sector, always want to serve the small, medium business sector. But to be viable, they're going to have to take this into consideration. Next slide, please. Because it's not just your avoided costs that are necessarily depressing the TRC, and you can see the bulleted list over to the right here does kind of dive into that in a little bit more detail, but it's everything we just spoke to. But there are other issues that we need to be concerned about, and this graphic presents those. So we need to be concerned about how codes and standards is limiting opportunity out there and pushing opportunity to very specific spaces, and whether or not industry standard practice is applicable at a high level across all sectors within whatever governing document that is rolled out there. So for example, is ISP in the wastewater treatment sector truly ISP in rural communities versus rural connected communities and urban communities? I don't know, but these are the questions as stakeholders we should be asking. In addition, we should be paying close attention to participant and measure costs. Remember, measure costs is one of the more significant levers that we can pull. So when we look at the DEER database and we look at incremental measure cost, is that really a viable measure cost? Is that too high? Is that too low? What I can tell you is that I've seen incremental measure costs in the DEER database that are grossly higher than what we're seeing in actual installed data, meaning that the database hasn't been updated, and the actual measure cost being attributed to that measure is higher than it has to be, which depresses the TRC. For custom calculated projects, how are we dealing with prevailing wage in public procurement? There is an additional cost often to public agencies to go through public procurement procedures and processes. We have to let our varying stakeholders know that prevailing wage is real, that we really can't get away from that. There are, depending on your particular procurement standards, there are forced labor pathways for smaller projects where we could use in-house staffing. However, we all know that by doing that, there's an opportunity cost. If we use forced labor account to get a project done, we're taking boots off the ground that may have to go out and do a maintenance project. Now we're putting them on an energy project. So we just need to be cognizant of that. And of course, we want to be really cognizant of incentives paid to free riders. This is actually quite a big deal. The net to gross ratio in of itself can take a project from not being cost effective to cost effective by simply altering that value. This is a shameless plug. Since the public sector is all but brand new, we need to ask the question, is it appropriate to prescribe net to gross values to all public sector actors, excluding K-12 as aligned to the small, medium business or commercial sector? Or should we have a formal discussion that reevaluates what the net to gross ratio in the public sector should be? The less, consequential values of administrative costs are there. It is a lever, but it's not going to be as impactful as savings or measure costs. And then lastly, I'll just say, market transformation happens quickly when folks embrace a technology. So we always have to be concerned about what market opportunity actually exists out there and how that's going to relate to portfolio design. So for example, the question today is, what does portfolio design look like when we no longer have interior LED A-lamps, screw-based A-lamps, or LED linear technologies to rely on? Next slide, please. And so this really ties it all together, right? When we're either designing a program and we're looking at how to balance that program, or we're working with a program, we really need to be aware of how that program is seeing their services to that community. And at the end of the day, these programs need to deliver services that have a TRC that exceeds 1. So they're going to be really laser focused in figuring that out. And so to do that, again, they need to really focus on that numerator. How am I going to maximize the avoided cost being delivered to the generalized ratepayer? And I'm going to come back to that one to close the slide out. They're going to have a focus on reducing the denominator, right? So it might be reduced incentives. And I think we've seen this over the years where there's been a pretty significant conversation about financing, potentially replacing or at least subsidizing or supplanting incentives. They're going to really be a focus on net to gross, right? How are we dealing with free riders and those incentives paid to free riders? And of course, net to gross can impact both the numerator and denominator side of the equation. I think we really want to talk about service impacts to non-HTR and HTR. Currently, there is a hard-to-reach adder, and that provides an incentive to serve some hard-to-reach customers, whether that's in urban areas or geographically hard-to-reach areas. Now, coming all the way back to the numerator, and this was something I realized before I left the Redwood Coast Energy Authority just about a month and a half ago, is that over the years, there's been, at least in my experience, a focus on delivering electricity savings. So you look at it and you say, okay, how am I going to deliver the net kWh required by our contract with program administrator X? And it's always been you're going to deliver, 1.8 million kWh or 7.4, whoever you are and whatever your scale is, at least in my experience, has been really focused in on the kWh. What I realized is that therm savings are equally important, if not more important, because what's happening is that as solar continues to go online, those avoided costs during the middle of the afternoon are being reduced. And so you only have so much option, or so many options within, that sector, whether it's commercial, industrial, agricultural, it's all the same in your climate zone. Pull that avoided cost for your climate zone, you'll see how that plays out. But a therm is a therm regardless of the time varying factor, right? So if you deliver a therm of savings, you will see, the avoided costs come into that portfolio. And so in working with Pacific Gas and Electric Company and in working with our team over at the Redwood Coast Energy Authority before I left, I realized that delivering that therm is increasingly more important at that portfolio level to be able to deliver a TRC that exceeds 1. Now, I have to admit I haven't dove too deep into SoCal Gas's filings or San Diego Gas and Electric's filings, but at the very surface level, I am seeing a trend where you have to wonder, why is SoCal Gas delivering a portfolio that is seemingly more attractive than some of the other utilities? Again, I haven't dug deep enough to make a determination, but it definitely looks interesting, and for those of you who are curious, I would encourage you all to dive deeper. Next slide, please. And so the last thing I'm going to mention is that at the end of the day, TRC doesn't necessarily take equality and equity into consideration, right? I mean, it's a very utilitarianism type formula. I really struggle with this. Is it the greatest good for the greatest number? Or should those who really need the help receive additional help? At the end of the day, I think this is really up to the program administrators within this frame. From a personal perspective, I think if we do not focus on equity, and we don't embrace this idea that some folks simply need a little boost to see the game, we're going to perpetuate a slide, right? So those folks who are living in disadvantaged communities or rural communities, they just simply need more support, and that means putting more money into those projects as compared to those who may not need as much. Of course, the TRC is really just measuring avoided costs over implementation costs or program costs, so it doesn't really get into the equity piece of this conversation, but it is something for each one of us to consider as we look at program design and as we look at engaging third parties moving into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. I've been noting a couple of questions that I'd love to throw back to you. We have a couple of minutes. One of them, there was a comment posed related to some of my opening statements at the top of the hour, asking about the CPU decision to lower the portfolio TRC threshold from 1.25 to 1.0 in the end. And as I understand it, that was true. It was initially proposed as a 1.25, and then the final decision elected to bring it back down to a 1.0. But the intent was that was in order to provide a ramp-in period, and the goal would be to actually come back up to 1.5 eventually, or 1.25, sorry. Is that correct?
I might defer to the CPUC folk on the line. My understanding was that it was that they could deliver a TRC that was less than 1.25, higher than 1, so long as they held public workshops to explain why they were not meeting that initial forecasted TRC of 1.25. That was my understanding. However, I do believe that we have some TRC gurus on the call that might be able to mention that in the chat function or confirm that in the chat function.
Got it. Thank you. And then one more. This is related to your opening slide on the CEDARS filing for statewide. If CCAs and RENs were included, Does that raise the portfolio TRC above 1? And if so, what is the full portfolio's TRC?
That is a wonderful conversation. Give me 30 seconds and I will answer that. It does. And the portfolio TRC is 1.35 with codes and standards, CCAs, and RENs included. Codes and standards is a complex conversation. If you remove that and only include CCAs and RENs, it drops to 0.89. And so what you can see with that variability is that codes and standards is very important to the portfolio, but I do want to mention that we really shouldn't be looking at TRC at the portfolio level, including codes and standards for the purposes of our call today.
Okay, great. Well, we'll hold some of the other questions until the end and get all panelists in on the conversation. So I'd now like to hand things over to Mohit.
Good morning. I will be talking a little bit about restructuring our energy efficiency portfolios to meet our carbon and equity goals going forward. And before I start off on my presentation, it seems good to point out explicitly, even though the previous presenters touched on this point, that TRC is primarily an energy resource evaluation metric. And when we look at our energy efficiency portfolios right now, they're trying to do a lot more than that. And there seems to be a mismatch between what we'd like our energy efficiency portfolios to achieve and how they're measured. So next slide, please. So energy efficiency portfolios, they aim to meet multiple objectives. Traditionally, it was how to meet future load and load growth in the most economic manner. And over time, there have been more objectives that the energy efficiency portfolio is responsible for. They include researching emerging technologies, administering low and middle income programs, training workforces, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but you get the point. And even more recently, there's been additional policy requirements. SB 350's doubling EE goal, SB 100's objectives of a carbon neutral grid, and so on. So next slide, please. Now, each of these objectives, they have a unique end goal. And in an ideal world, the end goal that you're trying to achieve through a program is what defines the metrics of success of the program, and that's what you're tested on. And going back to what I said a little bit ago, the TRC is a robust test for energy resources, but what do you do when you have all these other requirements as well? Next slide, please. So, in my opinion, balancing so many objectives, maximizing energy savings, and maintaining a portfolio that's cost-effective from an energy resource perspective may not be feasible going forward. And we're seeing that with recent PA filings that aren't able to meet a portfolio level TRC of 1.0. And one of the reasons is that we live, I like to call this a post-light bulb world, where really cost-effective lighting measures that really served as floats to this whole portfolio and kept them afloat and had them be cost-effective, they aren't available anymore. So what do you do now when you don't have this very cost-effective resource that you were able to use to trade off with all these other objectives that EE was trying to achieve that may not show up in, say, a TRC cost-effectiveness paradigm? And what's been happening recently is that we're seeing energy efficiency goals and targets decrease. And at the same time, California's climate goals are getting more stringent. So this is a really good time to take a step back and ask ourselves the question, is this trend correct? You know, we should be really sure that this is the right trend, because our guiding principle should be this, is what is the right amount of energy efficiency investment to meet our climate goals in an equitable and cost-efficient manner. And so using this guiding principle, our proposal is that the energy efficiency portfolio, which is one big portfolio right now, really should be 3 separate portfolios with their own objectives, their own metrics of success, and their own, say, cost effectiveness tests and so on. So could you move to the next slide, please? And those 3 portfolios would be a resource energy efficiency portfolio, a equity, and a long-term market transformation. And the existing EE portfolio sort of mixes and matches all of these into one big bucket. So talking a little bit about what I mean by resource energy efficiency. Resource energy efficiency programs are those programs that you are most likely to compare directly with supply-side resources to understand how much investment is required to best meet our state's near-term energy growth and climate goals. These are also those programs that are best suited to be analyzed with supply-side resources in an integrated resource planning type analysis, a proceeding that's currently underway at the PUC. So, and when we do this comparison of resource programs with supply-side resources, this is a good opportunity to rethink what costs and benefits should now be included such that these EE programs are compared apples to apples with supply-side resources. So when you do the cost effectiveness testing for these programs, you need to compare them fairly with respect to supply-side resources for the objectives you're trying to achieve there, which is near-term load growth. You want to meet it cost effectively, and you want to save carbon. One final word on this is that the avoided costs then need to be determined for these programs with respect to what our grid transformation goals are. SB 100, SB 350, both require large amounts of carbon reduction, and the avoided costs need to illustrate the marginal value of energy efficiency with this long-term vision in mind. So how much does energy efficiency resource programs contribute to this vision of a low carbon grid? I'm going to now move to the long-term market transformation bucket. And these are, again, programs that do intend to save energy and carbon either in themselves or by reducing market barriers to help resource programs adoption, right? So the issue here is that some of these programs that are now in the current portfolio, they don't lend themselves to a TRC evaluation framework as well, or a traditional evaluation framework. Because when you are constructing a program that's targeted at removing barriers of knowledge, education, training workforces, what you're really doing is you're breaking down barriers to enable the future success of resource programs, right? If you want to reach a particular hard-to-reach consumer cohort to enable code readiness, that's what you're doing through long-term market transformation. So these programs have slightly different objectives in the near term, but in the long term, they aim to help get the same objectives that the resource programs do. Another advantage of consolidating programs in the existing portfolio with long-term market transformation view is that currently we have emerging technology research, we have certain examples I gave of programs that try to reduce market barriers, and we have code readiness programs and codes and standards initiatives. This allows us to view the whole life cycle of this initiative of taking a measure from an emerging technology to mass market to a code and standard measure holistically and together, and allows us to think long term and then apply that long term thinking there. How would these programs be evaluated? These programs, the CPUC is working on a market transformation accord that considers a lot of what I've talked about. A lot of these programs would have near-term goals that may not be energy savings goals, but this restructuring allows you to take certain non-resource programs that we have and give them tangible, accountable goals to be able to achieve those barrier reductions that they're set out to, and then be tracked against that. I'm going to pause there and shift to equity programs. And this is sort of the trickiest bucket here, because when we do these equity programs, we acknowledge that the objective really is so much more than energy savings and carbon reduction. There's so many non-energy benefits associated with programs that we administer with an equity lens at the low-income and middle-income communities. But the funding for most of these programs currently comes from ratepayer funds, which may or may not pay back in terms of electric sector benefits. But I do think now is a really good time to have this honest conversation as how much money are we willing to spend on these equity programs to ensure that this transformation that we're trying to achieve to a low carbon grid, which would accompany with certain rate increases as we invest in storage and other technologies, how to make this equitable, and what's the role of these programs in helping bringing that about. And it's good to have that honest conversation about how much money you want to spend for this policy objective, rather than try to shoehorn this into how much energy benefit are we getting from these programs framework. Next slide, please. So this slide is just illustrative as to how we have one big portfolio that you could break up into these three components and really come up with goals, budgets, metrics of success for each bucket that's aligned with the policy objectives we're trying to achieve. And in doing so, get a lot more honesty in the system from top to bottom, best understand how to spend ratepayer money, our goals trackable and accountable. So along with this presentation, I've included a few slides as appendix slides that go into detail of this proposal. And while I did speak to this proposal, there's so much detail in there that I'm certain I may have forgotten or omitted a couple of specific points. And those should be, at least at a high level, included in the appendix slides. So when these slides get distributed, you'll have access to these and can reach out to us for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mohit. I do have a couple of questions that have come through regarding modifications or potential modifications to the TRC methodology. So I want to ask that to you before we go into the all-panel Q&A. So TRC is about resources only, and so doesn't align with the state grid transformation goals. Is there another measurement formula that does measure these other factors in scale with the cost effectiveness goals?
Right, so TRC, that's where the avoided cost importance comes in. So what the avoided costs really try to determine is to get to where you're trying to get to, which is a certain vision of a grid, what's the marginal value of investing in a certain resource? So you could apply that vision of avoided costs representing the true marginal value of EE to the grid we want to get to in a TRC-ish framework and get to the right answer. I think one of the bigger questions is when you do throw in energy efficiency resource programs with supply side programs and try to compare them, I think you'd really want to rethink the costs and benefits you want to account for, especially the cost. You know, in my opinion, a better way to compare energy efficiency program investment to supply side resources is via program administrator cost, and that's a longer discussion to be had.
Okay, thank you. And now I'll open up the Q&A for all panelists. Another question, can you comment on how NMEC, or normalized metered energy consumption, could affect the TRC? The current TRC does not incorporate NMEC techniques, and the CPUC is encouraging more NMEC-based programs.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to comment on that. SoCalRen actually implements an NMEC program right now. And so NMEC stands for Normalized Metered Energy Consumption. It's a different approach to calculating energy savings from a measure that uses a normalized model for the facility, and it's less technology or measure specific and tries to target more holistic projects. One of the advantages of an NMEC program is that you get to use an existing conditions baseline. So one of the challenges that ratepayer-funded energy efficiency programs have right now is that with rising codes and standards, there's fewer claimable savings out there, and the gap between claimable savings and on-bill savings is leaving a lot of stranded savings behind. So NMEC programs, especially in the context of like a whole building retrofit, can really allow you to get deep savings by using that existing condition baseline and using a wide range of measures to create an intervention, and ultimately just counting the savings that are actually realized at the meter. In terms of the effect on TRC, it's kind of interesting. These are programs, these NMEC programs are ex post. So since they're evaluating energy efficiency as it's counted, not as it's forecast, it could be some time before we see them have a significant impact on the portfolio. Some of that will also depend on whether forecasts will be allowed, whether NMEC program administrators and implementers will be able to forecast their savings, even though they may not be based on the detailed calculations that are typically used for custom and deemed programs, or custom programs, and then the deemed programs that rely on fixed values. So that's something that's being discussed right now. There's an open proceeding on the rule book for NMEC programs, and there's a very lively stakeholder process engaged in these very discussions. So they could have a more near-term impact depending on which way the policy directs us.
Okay.
And is it fine to add a sentence to that?
Of course, Mohit, go ahead.
Yeah, and NMEC, as was stated, is primarily a measurement device as well. So as far as how it impacts the TRC is concerned, it's a way of measuring savings, and as long as you measure savings and apply whatever net to gross filter you're doing to it, it shouldn't change anything beyond that.
Thank you, Mohit. All right, I have two questions that came through our Q&A function. They're quite similar and focused on public sector. What are the major highlights of TRC that public agencies should note when evaluating and packaging programs? And then one that gets more specific, how does TRC relate to energy audits in terms of the public sector?
I'll take both. On the latter question, this is Lou. On the latter question, your auditors from a third-party company will be delivering, or at least in theory, they should be packaging a project that makes sense to your site. However, they will need to deliver projects that meet the very specific TRC requirements, so they may pass, or at least not put kind of an exclamation mark by project elements that make sense to you as the customer, because they simply don't make sense to the generalized ratepayer. So be mindful of that, in that 3P, third parties, they're going to want to, sell you something, which is a good thing, but they're going to also want to make sure that they are floating above that TRC. So certain projects that may have a great return on your investment may not actually be that good for the generalized ratepayer through the TRC lens. And then on the first question, the big takeaways, at least from my perspective, assuming you're not an implementer or a non-resource program, is to really focus in on your measure costs. So, I represent a K-12 agency. I know that if I'm approached by a 3P, they provide a compelling project to me, it is in my best interest to figure out how I reduce total full measure costs, custom calc, to the greatest degree possible, because that's going to make the project more attractive to that third party, which means they may not just walk away from it. And now, if you're a non-resource program, it's really important that you take your measure costs, total savings, either therms or kWh into consideration. And so really learning about your building types, your gear hours of operation, and some of these other factors that are funneled into the TRC calculation can really afford and empower you to better engage with those third parties. Meaning if you're out there selling projects at assemblies with very low hours of operation and a coincident demand curve that doesn't really match the avoided cost calc curve, those are not going to be attractive projects to third parties, opposed to, let's say, selling projects or pushing projects at your corp yard, which may have longer gear hours of operation and a higher coincident demand factor.
Thank you very much, Lou. And it is 11:15. We'll go to the last slide, and I'll just say a thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Helena and LGC and SEEK for convening conversations such as these. I will hand it back to Helena for closing remarks.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to all of our speakers and for everyone for attending this webinar. The presentation will be distributed before the end of this week, in addition to the recording of this webinar, which will go up on the SEEK forum webpage. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.
All.